So for today's video, we're going to be going over noting meditation for beginners as taught by the Venerable Mahasi Sayadaw. I'll offer some tips and pointers that I've learned over my years of practice, and I'll also guide us through a 20-minute session where we can go a little bit deeper with our work of learning this noting style meditation. Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm Rob Phillips. I'm a full-time yoga and meditation instructor currently based out of Washington, D.C. And so for today, we're going to be going over what has been one of my kind of bedrock practices over the years, and that is noting meditation in the style of Mahasi Sayadaw. So over years of practice, things have evolved and I've gone through different techniques, different styles, but more than any other, this is really the one that I keep coming back to, and it's also my favorite one to teach to beginners because I find it's immediately accessible and really easy to learn. So for those of you who are already familiar with this practice, you can jump to the guided session in the timestamp right below. But for those of us who want a little bit of instruction and a little bit of guidance, I'm going to go through the technique as taught in Mahasi Sayadaw's book, Practical Insight Meditation. Now, if you're newer to meditation, you may not be familiar with Mahasi Sayadaw and his work, but he is a Burmese teacher who was really influential, especially when it comes to bringing Dharma, to bringing meditation over to the West. He taught many of the most influential American teachers, including Jack Kornfield and Joseph Goldstein. And really, his method is still taught to this day at insight meditation centers around the country. And that's where I learned it from American teachers who are kind of teaching in his tradition. So most important here is the idea of why this is called noting meditation. So the idea of using a note involves kind of taking what our sensory input is and applying what we would call a mental note or a label to it. The idea behind this being that when we label our experience, we can really acknowledge what that experience is moment to moment. And by acknowledging what that experience is moment to moment, that can help us to be more present and ultimately to unlock deep insights. Now, I've already talked a little bit about this topic in my earlier video called Noting the Six Sense Doors. Now, in that video, I limited the noting to simply our sensory experience, and I kept it fairly simple. Today, we're going to get a little more in depth and teach it truly in the way that Mahasi Sayadaw outlined in his book. And so it's going to have several steps along the way, and I encourage you to practice along with me as we explore these. And so as we get started with going into some of the specifics of this technique, I really want to outline what I think is one of the common pitfalls that I see practitioners fall into with this sort of work. And that's that they try maybe too hard, or they put too much effort behind the noting practice. I think it's important to remember that while we are meant to be diligent and consistent in our practice, the actual process of noting is gentle. It's meant to be kind of a light touch sort of acknowledgement of our experience as opposed to trying to cling on to it or grasp onto it in some sort of rigid way. In terms of our overall effort, I would say maybe 5 or 10% tops at any given moment should be dedicated to trying to do this noting practice. If you try too hard, the mind is going to close up, we're going to feel rigid, intense, and we're going to actually miss most of the benefits of it. And if you find that you're having trouble with this practice, if you find that it's not working for you, I would really encourage you to look at the level of effort that you're applying, because often I find that's the culprit for where people go wrong with it. Now, as you find this right amount of effort, as you really learn to be balanced with it, this is where the practice really unlocks itself, and this is where things really can get quite profound and deep from this sort of work. Now, the other thing to remember about noting or labeling practice is the exact note that we use is not so important. Notes are really just a tool that we use to help sharpen our mind, to help hone our awareness. So if you find yourself kind of spinning in thought, wondering if you use the right label or not, don't worry about it. Absolutely anything will do here. Again, it's a technique that's designed to help us be more present, and the labeling is just kind of the method by which we're doing it. In fact, as I'll discuss later on, eventually we're meant to drop the labels altogether and really just settle into kind of a calm awareness with our experience without the extra layer on top of it. And so the first level of this guided meditation process is to become aware of the movements of your breath at the abdomen. As we become more aware of these movements, we apply a mental note or a label to it. And so just to clarify, this idea of mentally labeling is simply using your internal monologue to acknowledge what your experience is. So in the case of noting our breath, all we would need to note is rising or falling, depending on whether or not the abdomen and the breath was rising or falling. And so let's practice this just real quick here for a few moments. Wherever you're seated, you can close your eyes. Feel the body relax. Feel yourself land here where you are. And notice the breath as it moves in your abdomen. Feeling all the sensations, just noticing what that's like for you. Now, as you start to tune more and more into the breath, internally, using your own mental voice, simply say to yourself, as corresponds to the breath, rising, falling, rising, falling, rising, falling, and so on and so forth. And so, important to understand here that we're not meant to repeat this blindly. We really are meant to acknowledge the rhythm of our breath. Now, the way I did it in my demonstration is just one breath per rise and fall. If you find it helpful, you can note multiple times through each rise, multiple times through each fall. As we'll get to in the next step, there's other stuff that we might be noting along the way. So it's not just about the breath, but this is the foundation. This is where we can get started with our practice. And the breath is our anchor. The breath is where we'll keep coming back to again and again. And so as we get to the second step of this process, I'd like to quote Venerable Mahasi Sayadaw himself. He says, and I quote, "While occupied with the exercise of observing each of the abdominal movements, other mental activities may occur between the noting of each rising and falling. This cannot be disregarded. A mental note must be made for each as it occurs." And so I can imagine as you did this practice with me, you had some experience of that. As we tune into the breath, a thought may arise, a daydream, a plan, a memory. All of that mental activity is part of our experience. And so the instruction here in this case is alongside the breath, we note what arises in the mind. So tying this back to what I was talking about earlier, remembering the exact note doesn't matter. We don't need to label exactly what we were thinking about or exactly, what the thought process was. I think that keeping things broad in general is definitely a better way to work so that we don't get too wrapped up in the process. So just for example, we can think of the general types of thoughts we might have, such as planning, remembering, daydreaming, thinking. So let's do this together, and as we did before, I'm going to narrate my process. You can listen and maybe try to follow along on your own as well. So with eyes closed, you can just settle in. And so here, noting my experience of not just the breath, but also my mental processes as well. Rising, planning, worrying, falling, planning, falling, rising, again, so on and so forth. And so as we get to the second level of practice, we're including not just the breath, but also any of our mental processes as they may arise. And so keeping in mind that the speed is somewhat arbitrary, that was kind of a medium pace, I think, that I did for my demo. And if you're new to this, it can be a little tricky. You expect that you'll feel confused at times, that you'll feel that the mind is just very busy. Don't get caught up in the content. Don't get caught up in the process. Keep noting, keep exploring. And so once we become a little more comfortable with noting the breath, with noting our mental processes, here now we really open up this noting practice to include everything. So this will include any sort of sensation that arises within the body. This will include sounds, sights, through even closed eyes or open eyes. Really, any word we can use to describe our experience, we can note. And Mahasi Sayadaw is very adamant that we should note each and everything. The practice is all about becoming aware of where our attention is at any given moment. And through this repeated acknowledgement of where our attention is, sharpening our concentration moment by moment. And so again, I'll do just a short demo of what this looks like, demoing on myself. And as I said before, we'll have a chance to put this into practice together later on through the guided session. But if you want to follow along with me, again, we'll sit here and we'll close our eyes. So pressure, hearing, rising, hearing, thinking, touching, falling, hearing, and so on and so forth. So that was a very small sample of my experience, and it can get much more elaborate than this. You might note things like tingling, tightness, even mild pain we can work with in our practice. It will come up from time to time. I'll say that with the caveat that, of course, don't risk harming the body in your practice, but some discomfort is almost inevitable along the way. And so, as I've said several times, but especially as we get to this third step where we kind of open things up, it does not matter what label you use. The label is a tool so that we can become more aware of where our attention is in any given moment. Really, the idea is to be vigilant and to really notice the patterns of our mind and to see where the attention goes and to really sharpen our sense of experience in each moment. Now, the fourth and final phase is kind of transcending these verbal labels within the mind. Once we've been practicing for some time, we may reach a point where the attention is moving so quickly, we're becoming so aware of everything that we're experiencing that it's really not practical to keep with the labels. And so at some point, we'll simply be resting in awareness. And so in this way, noting is kind of a tool that allows the attention to sharpen, that gets us up to speed so that eventually we can rest in a more natural awareness without needing to use such a kind of blunt object or forceful tool. Now, having said that, the time for this process is long. It may take even years of practice before we can really settle into that. And even in my own practice, having done this for years and years, I still fall back to this mental noting exactly as I demonstrated here. It can be really helpful if the mind is feeling busy or if you're just feeling a little stuck. It's great in that it's simple and easy to perform at any time. And that really is why it's my preferred method for teaching to beginners. And I really hope that you were able to experience some of that through my teaching so far. If you haven't yet, that's where the guided session will give us a chance to really go in deep without me, steering things so much. And as a final point, before we begin the guided practice, if you enjoyed my instruction and you want to see more videos like this, please be sure to like this video and please be sure to subscribe to my channel because I'll be coming out with more content like this each and every week. But for now, let's go ahead and begin. So now, building off of the instructions that I gave in the first part of the video, I'm going to guide us step by step through the processes I explored of noting meditation in the style of Mahasi Sayadaw. So if you're not already, please find your way into a comfortable seat. Close your eyes. Begin to relax. Begin to settle there. Finding a posture that allows you to feel somewhat lifted, somewhat upright. But around that lift, relaxing the shoulders, relaxing any tightness in the body, so that we feel nice and comfortable here. In a few moments, we'll begin our noting or labeling practice, but just a reminder as we do so to maintain that right effort, just a relaxed and calm use of our mental energy for this noting practice. And remembering that we don't need to get caught up in the type of note that we use. The noting is just a tool we use to help feel a bit more present, moment by moment. So to that end, having settled here for a minute or two, begin to draw your awareness to the movements of breath at your abdomen. Not trying to change the breath, not controlling it, just letting it be as it is. And noting how there's a natural rise and fall of the abdomen with each cycle of breath. Each breath will bring new sensations. Each breath will be slightly different than the one before it. So by tuning into the breath, we can become that much more present. It gives us kind of a ticket right here into the present moment. So with breath as our first and primary focus, let's begin to label the rise and fall of each breath. Just as I suggested in the introduction, with each inhale, note internally to yourself, rising. With each exhale, noting to yourself, falling. And again, coming back to noticing these movements of breath at the abdomen. And we'll keep it simple for now, just noting the rise and the fall. Keeping the body relaxed, keeping our posture upright. But training the mind in this process of labeling our experience, of applying a simple mental note to it. With each inhale, noting to yourself, rising. With each exhale, noting to yourself, falling. Let's continue this phase for about another minute or so. Now, of course, not losing track of the breath. It will remain part of our experience and certainly something we can anchor with. But almost certainly, as you tuned into the breath, there were moments where the mind was not with the breath. Maybe moments where you lost in thought. Moments where you were planning or analyzing things. So here for our second phase, continuing to notice the breath and to note the rise and fall. But if anything arises within the mind, we will label that as well. What note you use is not so important as the idea of acknowledging that a mental pattern has happened. So if you notice you are planning, you could just note to yourself, planning. You notice you are thinking or ruminating, you could note thinking or ruminating. If a memory arises, you could note remembering, or of course, any infinite variety of things that may show up within the mind. So here, continuing to note our breath, but also noting whatever may arise within the mind. Just applying the mental label again and again. Whatever arises within the mind, we make a mental note of that. As the breath rises and falls, we make note of that too. And if we forget to note, if we lose track of that, no problem. Simply start again. The power of this practice is we can instantly begin at a moment's notice, simply by labeling the next experience. Let's spend just another minute or so at this level of practice, noting whatever arises in the mind alongside the natural rise and fall of our breath. And here now we move into a third phase with this sort of practice, where we open up the labeling to literally anything that enters our awareness. So this still includes the movements of the breath. This still includes whatever may arise within the mind. But now we include all of our sensory experience as well. Particularly anything we feel within the body, but anything we hear or even a visual sense through closed eyes. the process and practice remains the same. Whatever enters the attention, make a quiet mental note of it. If you notice a sound, you might note hearing. If there's an itch within the body, you could note itching. Or anything else in the body, such as tingling, pressure, tightness. The words aren't so important as just noticing that a sense experience has happened. So working on this level for some time now, note anything at all that enters your awareness. And apply that quiet mental label to it. If you lose track and forget to note, simply start again. If you find the attention gets too scattered by including everything, remember you can simplify and just note the breath for some time. The exact label doesn't matter so much as finding that connection in this present moment. The labeling is a tool we use to help make that a bit easier. Again and again, noting and acknowledging your experience, applying a quiet mental note to whatever arises. Even if there's some discomfort, even if there's some resistance, simply note that. Even if you feel sleepy, even if you feel like you're not present, we can note that too. The power of this practice is it works regardless of what the content of our experience is. And we can pick it up and start again simply by remembering to note what our next experience is. Whatever arises, simply note it in your own quiet internal voice. Maintaining that light, consistent effort, but diligently through the remaining time here in this sit. Now, as we enter the final minute of this formal practice, we can stop labeling for the time being and just sit in calm presence. Notice how the body and the mind feel, noticing the effects of this noting practice. And together here, we can take a gentle inhale breath through our nose. As you exhale out your mouth, lower your chin down towards your chest and slowly open your eyes. And I'd like to thank you so much for joining me for today's video, for joining me for today's practice. Of course, if you have any questions, let me know in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video in practice, please be sure to give me a like. And if you want to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel because I'll be coming out with new content just like this each and every week. Thank you.